All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We always talk so much about the big push for clean energy, right?
Mm.
Cutting those emissions, wind turbines, solar panels, electric cars. And it's this picture that's always kind of in our minds.
It is, yeah.
But but have you ever actually sat down and thought about like what it actually takes to make all of that green tech?
Mm,
That is the question we're going to try to get at in today's deep dive.
love it.
We'll look at a paper called From Emissions to Resources, Mitigating the Critical Raw Material Supply Chain Vulnerability of Renewable Energy Technologies. Bit of a mouthful.
It is.
But it unpacks this challenge that's actually just as critical as cutting emissions, which is where do we get all the materials to build this cleaner world? And are those supply chains even secure?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all aware of the sort of big push towards solar photovoltaics, wind turbines, lithium-ion batteries, and water electrolyzers even, as key to reaching carbon neutrality. But this paper, From Emissions to Resources, really sort of makes you consider the foundational elements. Where are all these materials sourced? What are the potential weak points in getting them to where they need to be? I mean, it really shifts the focus from just the environmental benefits of these technologies to the very sort of resources that underpin them.
Yeah. So our mission today is, it's kind of twofold. First, we want to understand the potential vulnerabilities in the supply of these so-called critical raw materials,
Yeah.
CRMs,
Okay.
for these four technologies that we're talking about. Solar PV, wind turbines, lithium-ion batteries, and water electrolyzers.
Yep.
And second, and maybe more importantly, we're going to explore the four main pathways that this paper suggests we can take to actually shore up those supply chains and mitigate the risks.
And those four pathways that the paper, From Emissions to Resources, meticulously details are what we'll really be focusing on. We're going to look at how we can become more efficient with the materials we use, doing more with less, essentially. Then we'll consider, can we actually substitute critical materials with things that are more readily available, or even switch to entirely different technological approaches? The third one, then, is the potential of recycling,
Okay.
and designing these technologies from the outset with recycling in mind. And finally, we'll look at bringing more of this material sourcing and processing closer to home,
Right.
what the paper refers to as relocalization initiatives.
Right, right. And one of the things that jumped out at me right from the abstract is that there's no magic bullet here. There's no one solution that's going to completely eliminate the risks to the CRM supply chain.
No silver bullet.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a combination of all four of these levers working together to really build that secure foundation for our clean energy future.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into this From Emissions to Resources challenge as the paper lays it out. What's the first big takeaway here? Well, I think what's really significant is the fundamental shift in the types and quantities of resources we'll need. See, transitioning to clean energy technologies actually requires significantly more critical raw materials compared to, the fossil fuel-based technologies they're replacing.
Huh, more. So it's not just about using different materials.
No.
It's that we need more, period.
Yeah, and this applies across the board, right? It's not just about the obvious electrification of transport and power grids driven by wind, solar, and batteries.
Right.
It also extends to the production of sustainable fuels and chemicals where, technologies like water electrolyzers come into play. So it's across the board. We're going to need a lot more.
So I got to ask, when you hear about this increased demand for a whole new set of resources, I think a natural question pops up, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Myself included.
Yeah.
Are we just trading one resource scarcity problem for another? We're running out of oil, so now we're going to run out of lithium or cobalt or...
It's interesting because the paper touches on research suggesting that in terms of pure geological reserves, the stuff in the Earth's crust,
Right.
we generally have enough of these materials. It's not necessarily about the planet running out.
Okay, so it's not like the cupboard is bare.
Hey.
It's more nuanced than that.
Actually, see, the real crux of the issue isn't the lack of materials. It's what the paper terms sustainable access.
Okay, sustainable access.
Yeah.
Break that down for me a little bit.
Okay. So this is a far more complex idea than just availability. It's there. I can dig it up.
Right.
It encompasses our ability to extract and process these materials while minimizing the environmental and social costs.
Okay.
Throughout the entire life cycle. So from the initial mining and refining stages,
Right.
all the way through to eventual recycling.
So it's not just about getting it out of the ground. It's about
Whole shebang.
the whole shebang.
Yeah, the whole process.
Okay, so let's talk about that environmental footprint for a second.
Yeah.
Because mining these raw materials, that takes a lot, right? We're talking energy, water, chemicals. It's a big operation.
It is a huge operation, yeah.
And one of the things that really stood out to me in the paper is that they talk about lower ore grades, right, in newer mining locations, and how that could actually make the environmental impact even worse. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah. It makes sense, right? If you think about it, when we have to dig up and process more rock to get the same amount of the desired material, because the concentration of that material in the ore is lower, then naturally the energy, the water, the chemical demand,
it all goes
per unit of extracted resource, they go up.
Yeah. We're just using more stuff to get to less stuff.
It's a real kind of, it really underscores that interconnectedness we were talking about earlier, right? Clean energy ambitions rely on these materials, but obtaining them sustainably, that in itself is a challenge that needs clean energy solutions.
Right. It's like a snake eating its own tail in a way, right?
Yeah.
We need clean energy to mine the materials.
You get clean energy.
To get clean energy.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not just the environment, right? The paper also talks about the social impacts of mining. I mean, you're talking labor conditions, potential health concerns, especially in some of the countries where these materials are being sourced. That's a whole other side of this clean energy transition that doesn't always get enough attention,
No, it doesn't. I mean, beyond that as well, the paper also emphasizes the geopolitical vulnerabilities, right? Inherent in the current situation. I mean, the fact that the mining of many of these CRMs is concentrated in just a handful of countries, coupled with China's dominant role in refining and processing.
Yeah.
I mean, that creates significant strategic autonomy concerns for other regions of the world.
For sure. And it's not like we can just snap our fingers and open new mines everywhere, right?
Yeah.
This takes time.
Absolutely.
The paper mentions these increasing lead times. The time it takes to bring a new mine into production. And, they suggest that.
Yeah. Just
relying on new extraction, it's not a fast enough solution to keep pace with how quickly demand is growing.
No, absolutely. And the timeline from, initial exploration to a fully operational mine, it really has lengthened in recent decades. Permitting processes, environmental regulations, technological complexities, it all adds up.
Yeah. And the paper does acknowledge that, producing all this material for clean energy.
Yes.
It's going to lead to an increase in overall emissions.
It will, yeah.
At least in the short term. But that increase
is significantly less.
Is still less than if we just stuck with fossil fuels, right? So it's kind of it's a necessary evil, but one we need to manage carefully. Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about those mitigation pathways that the paper outlines.
Okay.
Starting with material efficiency.
Okay.
What does that actually look like in the real world?
Well, material efficiency is fundamentally about, achieving the same performance with a reduced quantity of material.
Okay.
Think about it in concrete examples. So designing a solar panel that generates the same amount of electricity but uses less silicon.
Right. Less input for...
The same output.
Same output.
Or developing a lithium-ion battery with a higher energy density, right? That requires less lithium, cobalt, nickel for the same storage capacity. And for wind turbines, it could involve, more efficient generator designs that lessen the need for rare earth elements. So we're just trying to streamline, be more efficient with what we use.
And there's some pretty ambitious projections in here from the European Commission talking about potential efficiency gains, right? They're talking about reductions in material use per gigawatt of capacity, ranging from 65 to 95% by 2050. For some key CRMs, I mean,
they're huge numbers.
Those are really significant numbers.
Yeah.
What's driving these projected improvements?
Well, economies of scale, for one.
Okay.
As production volumes increase, manufacturers can often find ways to optimize their processes.
Right.
Reduce waste.
Just getting better at it.
Yeah, just getting better at it. And then there's the ongoing incremental improvements in the, design and manufacturing processes themselves.
Okay.
Right? So the paper emphasizes that these projections are based on, known technological trajectories. We're not relying on some completely revolutionary breakthrough that, hasn't been discovered yet.
Right. But even with those, potentially massive reductions in material use
Yeah.
per unit of energy.
Hmm.
The paper still says that. Look, this isn't a silver bullet. Material efficiency on its own isn't enough.
No. The core reason is the sheer magnitude of the energy transition we need to accomplish. I mean, even if we become incredibly efficient in our use of these materials, per solar panel, per wind turbine, per battery, the total number of these devices we need to deploy, I mean, to reach our climate goals,
Yeah.
it's so vast that the overall demand for the materials will still be enormous. I mean, look at the projections from the International Energy Agency.
Right.
It really illustrates that dramatic increase in overall material demand.
And they even suggest that those IEA projections for the deployment of clean energy capacity, especially for something like solar PV,
Yeah.
might actually be underestimates of what we'll ultimately need.
Yeah. And the paper cites research by Hagel and colleagues suggesting that the potential for solar photovoltaic deployment could be 4 to 5 times greater than some current estimates. So yeah, that total material demand could be even higher than we anticipate right now.
So efficiency is important, but
Crucial, but
it can't be the only tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to the second mitigation pathway that the paper talks about, which is substitutivity.
okay.
And this is the idea of replacing those critical materials with more abundant alternatives, or,
Yeah.
or even switching to entirely different technologies altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think one prominent example is the shift we've seen with Tesla, moving towards using lithium iron phosphate batteries, LFP,
Right.
in some of their electric vehicles instead of nickel manganese cobalt NMC batteries.
Right.
And a primary motivation for this change was to reduce or eliminate the use of coal-road,
Oh,
which is classified as a CRM due to both supply risks and ethical concerns in its mining.
yeah.
And it's interesting, the EU's methodology for assessing the criticality of materials considers potential performance trade-offs when one material is substituted for another, like the lower energy density of LFP batteries compared to NMC.
Right. So it's not just about, is it available?
Yeah.
It's about, does it work?
Exactly. Yeah. Can we actually do it?
Yeah. Does it actually do the job? And then there's ongoing research looking at substituting materials within existing technologies.
Yeah.
Like trying to replace silver, right?
Yeah.
With more readily available and less expensive materials like copper or aluminum in silicon-based solar panels.
Researchers like Hagel and their team are actively exploring these alternatives.
So there's a lot of potential there, but it's not.
No.
It's not a done deal yet.
Not at all. No.
Okay. And when it comes to wind turbines,
Yeah.
what's the main CRM concern there?
Well, it revolves around the use of rare earth elements
Yeah.
in the mold. The powerful permanent magnets that are so crucial for efficient electricity generation.
Right.
And the paper kind of goes on to introduce this broader concept of shifting towards entirely different, perhaps less mature technological approaches that could inherently have a lower reliance on these problematic materials.
Okay. And that brings us to figure 2 in the paper.
Yeah.
Which gives us this really interesting qualitative comparison of different alternatives to our main clean energy technologies.
Yes.
And it looks at how easily they could be scaled up and how vulnerable they are to CRM supply chain issues.
It's really looking at that upper right quadrant, I think, of the figure. That's particularly noteworthy.
Okay.
Where you've got these alternative technologies for large-scale stationary electricity storage
Okay.
that appear to offer both significant scalability potential and a lower vulnerability to CRM supply chain disruptions compared to conventional lithium-ion batteries.
Okay.
So this suggests that if securing enough lithium, nickel, or cobalt
Yeah.
becomes a major hurdle, we might have some viable alternative storage solutions that we can deploy
At scale.
at scale.
Okay. And what about for some of the other technologies? The paper mentions perovskite solar PV as a potential alternative
Yeah,
to traditional silicon-based panels.
it does, but with a caveat, right?
Yeah. What's the catch?
Well, perovskite solar cells, they hold a lot of promise as a potentially scalable alternative to silicon,
Okay.
but their widespread adoption is currently limited by ongoing challenges related to their long-term stability and lifespan.
Okay.
They still require some critical raw materials,
Right.
but their overall CRM footprint could be less problematic in the long run. And then it mentions organic PV,
Right.
which has even fewer CRM issues.
Okay.
But its scalability for large-scale energy generation is still uncertain. But, on the flip side, the silver used in current silicon PV technology
Right.
isn't actually considered a major long-term CRM risk.
Okay. So, there's pluses and minuses as always.
Mm-hmm.
What about green hydrogen? What about producing that through water electrolysis? Are there other methods out there that might be less reliant on these critical materials?
There are, but a lot of them haven't reached the scale necessary to significantly replace, the more established methods. The paper does highlight alkaline water electrolysis as a mature technology that doesn't have any significant reported material limitations.
Yeah.
So that's something.
Okay. And wind power. The paper mentions airborne wind technology,
Yeah.
but then notes that it's not really scalable right now.
Yeah.
But we do have wind turbines that don't use rare earth elements.
Absolutely, yeah.
Those are already out there.
They are established, they're scalable, and there's even potential for, further material substitution, like using aluminum instead of copper in some components.
Right. So there are options. And then,
Yeah.
we can talk about ocean energy, which, in theory,
Could be huge.
could be huge. It could be a substitute for both wind and solar power in certain coastal regions.
For sure, but
Big but. Yes.
they still rely on CRMs,
Yeah.
and none of them have demonstrated the scalability yet.
Okay. So ocean energy, still kind of
Against sky.
way off. Okay. For now.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about how we might be able to substitute some of these materials or even the technologies themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to the third pathway, which is recycling.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
and eco-design, which feels like, that's a big piece of the puzzle, right?
It is.
For creating a truly sustainable system, down the road.
Absolutely. And while the recycling of many of these materials from clean energy technologies is still in its early stages,
Right.
it is expected to become increasingly important as these technologies reach the end of their lives.
Right. But there's a big point that they make in the paper, which is for at least the next 15 years or so,
Yeah.
primary raw materials, the ones that we dig out of the ground,
Yeah.
those are likely to continue to dominate.
Yeah.
Simply because we just don't have enough old solar panels and wind turbines and batteries
No, we don't.
available yet.
To play
Yeah.
to make recycling
A big enough impact.
a big enough dent.
Yeah, we're in this weird kind of transitional period.
We are. And on top of that, a lot of this stuff, it lasts a long time.
It does.
A solar panel could be running for 25 years. An electric vehicle battery could have a second life in stationary storage.
Absolutely.
So.
And the paper also points out the actual technologies and processes for recycling these materials, particularly lithium-ion batteries, haven't really converged on a single best approach yet. There are various competing methods for recycling lithium-ion batteries, including shredding, followed by hydrometallurgical or pyrometallurgical processes.
Right, so lots of different approaches.
Lots of different approaches, and the efficiency and effectiveness of these methods can vary depending on the specific chemical composition of the battery.
So it's not line. It's
Yeah.
not one size fits all.
No, it's not. No, it's important to evaluate the environmental impact and the economic viability of these different recycling technologies. We need to proactively invest in building up the infrastructure now
Right.
to handle the volumes that will become available in the future.
Okay.
So even though it's not, a huge part of the picture right now,
Yeah.
we need to be thinking about it now
Absolutely. Yeah.
and building that infrastructure
Yes.
so that we're ready for it.
Down the road.
Down the road. And it's not just about having the right technology, right? The paper talks about how these sustainable recycling facilities, they're going to require resources too.
Of course.
Renewable energy to power them, careful management of water and air emissions.
Yeah.
But it does say,
Yeah.
the paper points out
It does.
that producing those primary raw materials for mining, that generally requires more.
Considerably more.
More energy.
Energy and resources.
And resources overall. Absolutely. And it's not just the environmental impact either. The paper talks about social acceptance, right? That whole NIMBY thing.
Right. Not in my backyard.
Nobody wants a recycling facility in their backyard.
Yeah.
So open and transparent dialogue with communities, proactive government support for permitting, and environmental safeguards.
Right. Make sure that it's done responsibly and in a way that doesn't negatively impact communities.
Absolutely. And the paper, it also talks about urban mining, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. Recovering those valuable CRMs from, our old electronics,
Yeah.
old computer cell phones,
Yeah.
which I was surprised to learn can actually contain higher concentrations of some of these metals
Yeah.
than the ores that we mine.
And the ores that we mine.
That's wild.
It is. It is wild, yeah. And to effectively tap into this urban mine, we need the right regulatory frameworks
Right.
and market incentives in place.
Right. But we got to incentivize.
We got to incentivize it. Establishing collection and sorting systems for electronic waste,
Mhm.
designing products that are more easily recyclable,
Right. Right.
and potentially even implementing bans on the export of electronic waste to countries with less stringent environmental standards.
Okay. So there's a lot. There's a lot we can do there. And then there's the ocean.
The ocean, always the ocean.
Right.
Full of potential.
Which, theoretically it could be this vast source of
Vast.
raw materials, but
The extraction technologies are still relatively nascent and would likely require substantial amounts of renewable energy to be, economically and environmentally sustainable.
right. Okay. So under this whole recycling and eco-design pathway, the paper really stresses the importance of thinking about recyclability from the very beginning.
Absolutely, yes. Designing products with end-of-life material recovery in mind. Design for disassembly, design for recycling.
Right.
It's crucial. Closing the loop, creating a more circular economy for these critical raw materials, that's the goal.
Okay. Let's move on to the fourth and final pathway, which is relocalization.
Right.
And this is the idea of shifting the mining, refining, and manufacturing activities related to clean energy technologies away from the regions that currently dominate these sectors. And we all know
China.
who we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room.
It is.
China currently holds a very significant and in some cases dominant position across the entire value chain for many CRMs and the components used in clean energy technologies. And this concentration,
Great.
it creates potential vulnerabilities, geopolitical instability, trade disruptions, and even differing environmental and labor standards.
And we are seeing some policy efforts to change that in the U.S. with the Inflation Reduction Act, and in the EU with the Critical Raw Material Act, CRMA, and the Net Zero Industry Act, NZAA, which are all aimed at reducing that dependence on China and boosting domestic capacity. All the way from the refining and processing of raw materials, all the way to the manufacturing and eventual recycling of clean energy technologies. So they're trying to bring it all back home.
Trying to shorten those supply chains.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the policy support in the U.S., particularly through that IRA, seems to be pretty strong for wind power and solar PV compared to the EU.
It does.
And for newer sectors like lithium-ion batteries and water electrolyzers, well-designed regulations and incentives could have a big impact.
Absolutely.
But the paper does say that it's going to be a lot harder to shift things for solar PV manufacturing, just given how dominant China is in that area.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one to crack.
It is.
Yeah.
And, they stress that the success of these relocalization initiatives, it depends on a lot of things.
Yeah.
Dedicated industrial policy, public awareness, social acceptance, and funding across the entire value chain.
Yeah.
From R&D to deployment. Yeah.
And then there's figure 3, which gives us a really good qualitative assessment of the current CRM supply chain vulnerability for these technologies and how these 4 levers, efficiency, substitution, recycling, and relocalization, how they could potentially impact that vulnerability over time.
It lays it all out.
It does. And if we look at lithium-ion batteries, for example, a combination of these efforts is expected to really reduce the overall risk, although there's still that potential for, short to medium-term price volatility. And for wind power, that potential for substituting away from the permanent magnets with those rare earth elements. Well, that looks pretty promising for lowering the long-term supply chain risk.
Okay.
But then we have solar PV.
Right.
Which is currently showing the highest risk.
The highest risk because of that dependence on China.
Yeah, exactly. But the relocalization efforts, particularly in the U.S., are really showing some positive potential for risk reduction. And the paper highlights the speed at which the U.S. has begun to establish a significant domestic PV value chain, leveraging existing research and development infrastructure.
Right. They've managed to build out a domestic solar PV manufacturing capacity of over 10 gigawatts in under a year.
Right.
Which, that's pretty remarkable.
It is. It really shows that industrial capacity can be reestablished relatively quickly when the support is there and when the know-how is there.
Right. And then Water electrolysis, relatively low risk right now,
Yeah.
and could decrease even further as the EU and the US scale up their green hydrogen ambitions.
Right. And then, this was interesting to me. The paper also talks about the booming demand and recent supply challenges for something that we often overlook.
What's that?
Electricity cables. I mean, this is fundamental to the entire energy transition, right? You need those cables to get that energy from where it's produced to where it's needed.
Yeah.
And the Financial Times reported last year on these emerging supply constraints for electricity cables.
Yeah.
So it's another potential bottleneck that we need to pay attention to.
Right. We often focus on the big shiny technologies.
Yeah.
But it's the supporting infrastructure.
It's the nuts and bolts.
The nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
That can really, trip us up.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, big picture.
Big picture.
It sounds like the takeaway here is that a comprehensive and integrated strategy
Yes.
that uses all four of these pathways
All of them.
is what we need to reduce those vulnerabilities in the CRM supply chain. You can't just pick and choose.
It has to be multi-pronged for sure.
Yeah.
And the paper really argues for that consistent, multifaceted approach, combining that enhanced material efficiency, strategic substitution, robust recycling systems, and thoughtful relocalization initiatives. Offers them the most promising path towards mitigating the supply chain tensions we're facing.
Right. And there's also this call for more research and innovation.
Absolutely, across all these areas.
Across the board. And the paper also highlights the importance of those proactive, well-designed regulations, globally. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is a great example of that.
Absolutely. And then, crucially, the paper talks about the role of social awareness and public acceptance.